topic, and I went back and looked. He did 5 articles on the topic in total, ending on November 27th with Civ's "May They Rest in Peace," and he was right. Greg was the guy that worked with younger members of the group to get them up the learning curve. He was instrumental in doing that for Jeana Curro, James Bajani, Vicky Yee, and Wilfred Wong at UBS, and also Adam Rivkin at RBS. But it wasn't just the people at work who could pay him dividends, as he was able to delegate more to them. He cultivated young people from across the industry, answering their questions both on the mortgage market and on the career ladder and life in general. My son, Louis Perwin, was a beneficiary of this. My relationship with Greg very quickly evolved from someone who worked in my group to a real friendship. I was leaving UBS and considering going to Amherst, and I asked Greg what he thought. I relied more on Greg's advice than anyone else. He knew Amherst because he once worked there. He knew me. I trusted his judgment, and he had a very high emotional IQ, which allowed him to think things through from my perspective. Greg and I remained close friends through the years. He was a very loyal friend, and I depended on him to keep my confidences. I often relied on his advice on how to handle various sticky situations. We chatted often, seeing each other for dinner and drinks. I always appreciated his honesty, his kindness, his excellent judgment, and his superb sense of humor. And I had hoped to be able to work with him again on Mark's Go Fish theory, as he was slated to join Amherst Capital Management, where I was consulting. When Amherst was recruiting him, I was sure he was the right hire. It wasn't just his broad knowledge of the housing and mortgage and fixed income markets, but rather his flexibility, his wonderful way of working with people, and his kindness that made me really confident in the choice. Rest well, dear friend.
Conventional wisdom says that it's far more common for people to become close friends early in their lives than it is later in their lives. For example, as children who meet at school or camp or high school, as young adults in college, as professionals or working men and women struggling to build careers. And that makes sense. As we get older, we already have attachments, we're busy, we have biases, ambitions, pressures, anxieties, obligations. Forming new friendships may not be high on our list of priorities. Greg, of course, confounded that conventional wisdom. As you know already, he welcomed new people into his life. He welcomed their individual perspectives and their unique, maybe even divergent ideas. He viewed them as an opportunity for personal growth, sometimes as a mentor, sometimes as a boss and mentor, sometimes as a coworker or peer, and in my case, as a coworker, peer, and a really, really good friend. I guess it was inevitable that we would eventually meet. We had lengthy careers on and off Wall Street with related interests and surprisingly similar aspirations. He worked on both the sell and the buy sides of the business, and I worked on both the sell and the buy sides of the business. He worked primarily in mortgages and ABS. I've worked primarily in mortgages and ABS. He hated wearing ties. I hate wearing ties. Professionally, we were both children of the 80s and lived through periods of extreme innovation in the bond market, rapid growth in structured products, and spectacular bust. I liked and respected him because he had strong ethics and was well-grounded. He never wanted, in Tom Wolfe's famous words, to be a master of the universe. He didn't get caught up in structuring or marketing or recommending deals of questionable economic or social value in the run-up to the credit crisis. He was scrupulously honest. He managed to avoid becoming disenfranchised demoralized, or marginalized, following the market's very jarring descent. As a contemporary, I came to view him, and will continue to view him, as a role model, not only for the 80s generation, but for those younger or much younger than us. Greg actively mentored people who were less knowledgeable or less experienced than he was. And he did it naturally and with empathy, and he conveyed excitement. He made you feel good about your aspirations. And it didn't matter if you didn't work for him. I was talking with someone a couple of weeks ago who told me that out of the blue he called Greg for advice earlier this year, and he ended up getting taken out to dinner. Greg was like that. Although he and I first met at a research meeting many years ago when he worked at Charles Schwab and I worked at Salomon, we really only got to know each other once we both landed at RBS in Stamford in 2010. We had the good fortune to work with great people, and he and I did indeed have a lot in common. We got to know each other quickly, and our friendship was cemented on a fixed income strategy marketing trip to Beijing and Tokyo later that year. As you might guess, those trips often become a kaleidoscope of flights, meetings, taxis, presentations, speeches, meals. And after years of such experiences, I lived by the rule of never turning down the opportunity to sleep or eat. Greg seemed to intuitively share that approach. And aside from jet lag, I don't think sleeping was really a problem for either of us. Food, though, was a very different story. Greg did not eat meat or dairy, and I kept kosher. So you can imagine the culinary bonding experience we shared. An adventure that only a vegan and a Jew trying to keep kosher in Asia could appreciate. We bonded over other things as well. They say you never forget watching your first sumo wrestling match. And we had the privilege of going to one on that same trip. And I can confirm that, yes, you never do forget. We shared a love of automobiles and attended the New York Car Show together. We both owned Mazda Miatas and Volkswagen GTIs. And Greg listened politely as I teased him, describing the latest exotic vehicles that my son Jeffrey, an automotive journalist, had the opportunity to test, and that he nor I would ever actually get to drive. We discussed the ups and downs of our jobs and careers, both of us stable in so many ways and restless in others. In late 2011, when I moved to the West Coast for my job at Western Asset, our shared experience expanded to include the challenge of working in cities far away from our wives. It's not a myth that managing long-distance relationships is an undertaking that requires very strong partners. Although Joni and I traveled back and forth on a regular basis to be together, more weekends than not, we were alone. I remember, though, that one of the highlights of my time in Pasadena was a brunch on one of those Sundays that Joni and I were apart. It was at a restaurant called Mi Piaci on East Colorado Boulevard, and it was with Greg and Alysoun while they were visiting the Los Angeles area. The company that day was wonderful, and I got to watch two strong partners together. This past July, Greg invited me to attend a discussion Wells Fargo was hosting in Manhattan with former Mayor Michael Bloomberg, who, in typical fashion, was mesmerizing. Afterwards, Greg and I went out to dinner. I know I was incredibly excited. Actually, my wife Joni can vouch for that. I didn't stop talking when I got home that evening. Usually it's the other way around. Greg knew that I would really appreciate that invitation. I started my career in 1983 as a computer programmer at Salomon Brothers in the information technology department just a year after Bloomberg left. His last job at Salamander was running that department, and even then, he was a local legend. For me, going to see and hear the mayor was a little bit like returning to the house where I was born. It was nostalgic and inspiring. It was a very thoughtful gesture, very meaningful to me, very typical of Greg. That's how I'm going to remember him. Since I received the news about Greg's passing, I've been struggling with the words to express my grief. I'm still in denial. I still instinctively go to text him or send him an instant Bloomberg message about some piece of news or an idea or with a question. Like so many other people I've talked with during the past few weeks and whose lives Greg touched, I have this overwhelming vision of a kind, smiling individual with a subtle, wicked, ironic sense of humor. An individual with insight into the behavior of other people, companies, markets, and life. An individual with empathy and a desire to help those around him. An individual with a passion for cars, animals, and most of all, Alysoun. Thank you.
So many people here. My name's Jeana. I had the privilege of working for Greg twice in my career, actually. I remember when I first met Greg, it was 2005. It was my very first job out of college. It was probably Greg's 40th job at that point. We used to tease him about hopping around a lot, which you all know. But anyway, when Greg joined our little team, he fit in right away. He had this super quirky sense of humor. He had an even quirkier polo shirt collection. And he had this deep love of old movies and Chinese food and Mexican food and pretty much all food, as people have commented. We were like a little family at UBS, and we knew right away Greg was one of us. He came up with these really funny little nicknames for everyone. Vicky was the queen bee, Laurie was the boss, I was the mathematician, and then there was the pillar. We laughed a lot, and we all had so much fun working together then, even through the ungodly hours on Tuesday nights. Greg and I then went our separate ways, but reunited at RBS in 2010, and we picked up right where we left off. Greg was recruited, and he had called me and said, would you be interested in working for me again? And I was like, yes, I don't need any details. Where do I sign? How do we make this happen? And I was ready to go without hesitation. But, Greg being Greg, took all these extra steps, and he said, I want to make sure this is a good move for you. You like the people, you're valued, you'll grow. And he really just went out of his way to make sure this was the right opportunity for me. And of course it was. Greg always went out of his way to take care of younger people who were developing, and that's just one of the many things that made him such an amazing boss. Our working relationship, I'll admit, I think it was pretty remarkable, so much so that people would come up to us, and I think that they would comment on how strong of a partnership they had. I think maybe they were even a little envious. When summer interns would come through, they would all want to spend time with us, and at the end of the summer, they would kind of line up hoping we would recruit them. And I really attribute all of this to Greg and this amazing respect and kindness he showed to absolutely everyone, summer interns notwithstanding. I always remember that I would introduce Greg to others. Sorry. Okay, I would. Oh man. Okay, I would introduce Greg to others, whether it was customers or friends. I would say, "This is my boss, Greg," and he would say, "Oh, sorry." He would say, "No, you're my partner." And he would always, we're a team and you're my partner. And he'd always say things like that. That made me feel so special. Sorry. Okay. I've spoken a lot about Greg in a work context because that's how we met. That's how we first met. But Greg was so much more than that. He was so much more than a colleague. He was so much more than a mentor, and he was so much more than the best boss that I've ever had. First and foremost, Greg was an amazing friend who I could count on for anything. Sometimes I would have dinners planned that night, and I would send him the restaurant website and the wine list, and he would help me pick out bottles of wine because I had no idea what I was doing. And then there were bigger things too, like I can't even tell you how many times he offered me his car when I didn't have a car, or if I ever needed a personal reference for anything, he was always, he wrote me numerous recommendations for law school, for my co-op board, for volunteer positions, you need it. Whenever I needed something, big or small, Greg was always happy to help. And most of the time I didn't even have to ask him. He just jumped right in and offered. Even when I was interviewing for the job that I have now, Greg helped me through the entire process. He prepped me for my interviews, and he helped me with the negotiation, and then I got a contract, and he read it, and then he made changes, and then they took the changes, and I was like, oh my God, Greg's so good at this. And I remember asking my parents for help during this process, and they were like, well, what does Greg think? What does Greg think you should do? I trusted Greg without hesitation. I valued his opinions, and I rely on him for everything. So my second point about Greg is he was always right. And I'm not just talking book smarts or ideas. We all know that. But Greg had this unbelievable perceptiveness where he could pick up on the tiniest, most subtle details and figure out exactly what was going on. And he could look at people's behavior and their mannerisms, and he could tell what kind of person somebody was. Or he could predict I don't know, what somebody was up to based on the tiniest little things. And often he's come up with these theories, and I would always say, Greg, you're crazy. How did you get that from that? But every single time, sometimes days later, sometimes months, I was always proven wrong. So I'll finally admit it, Greg, you were always right. My last point about Greg was that he was an unbelievably warm soul. He took the time to get to know everyone that he crossed paths with. So just an example, we'd get breakfast together every morning, and we'd go to pay, and Greg would have conversations with everyone, the cashiers. Most people swipe their credit card and leave, and then Greg would be like, hi, Barbara, how are you? How was your weekend? How was your move? How was your son? And he just knew everything that was going on in everybody's lives, and he brought a smile to everybody's face. And I think it's just because he took the time to get to know everyone. And he gave everyone so much courtesy and so much respect, whether they were the most senior global head of who knows what or the parking garage attendant. I mean, he treated everyone exactly the same. I really think Greg brought so many people in this world so much happiness, I think more than he ever realized. And for that, he will be missed by so many. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Adam Rivkin. I appreciate you having me here to speak today. Thank you, Alysoun. What I wanted to do is read some prepared remarks. These are what I originally sent Alysoun. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to say today, and I think a lot of people had trouble finding the words to express how I feel. So I looked back over what I originally wrote and decided this is probably the most demonstrative of really how I feel and how I think I'll sort of proceed going forward in recollecting Greg. So, to begin, I cannot describe to you how devastated I was to hear about Greg. He was one of my very favorite people. We met 5 or 6 years ago at RBS, where he was assigned to be my summer mentor. Corporate mentor-mentee assignments are usually fruitless, but Greg and I became friends instantly. In retrospect, I can't exactly put my finger on why, but I think we just shared a vibe. We had a lot in common. We were both from San Diego. He grew up just 15 minutes north of me, although 30 years prior. We had similar taste in books, music. We were both kind of pessimistic about RBS at the time, as a lot of people were. But really what brought us together was intangible. It was just that shared vibe. He had that rare combination of intense energy that everyone's been talking about, the unrelenting kindness that everyone has been talking about, alongside, as I'm sure some of you know, moments of absolutely hilariously passionate frustration. So I think, I'll interrupt myself here, by far the funniest guy I've ever known when upset or frustrated was Greg Reiter. There are plenty of dry, guarded, self-serving personalities in the world, and I think the people blamed the street for having even more of them, but Greg was certainly not one. He was exuberant, and his exuberance was always contagious and real. And so while it's easy to lose oneself or a connection to the greater world over time, Greg never did, not even close. He knew that life is temporary and that nothing is perfect, yet his sense of humor and adventurousness were always unshakable. So I remember once we were working together at Freddie. I was walking between buildings on my way to meet him. We had a meeting or something together. And I saw a deer. So Greg obviously was an animal lover, and so I took out my phone, snapped a picture. You know, you don't see too many deer in San Diego where I'm from. And so I sort of waited a few minutes, watched, and then went over to the meeting. I was late for the meeting, of course. When I arrived, I explained to Greg what I saw, showed him the picture, and sort of expected him to have one of his moments of being frustrated. You know, why are you late to this meeting? But of course he didn't. He was just happy. He said, "Oh, that's so cool. I'm so glad you saw that." He knew that that's really what mattered in life. He was excited. He said that's what life is all about. It was just a momentary and simple reflection on impermanence and serenity and enjoying the moment. But it's something that's stuck with me. So beneath all of his job hopping and his choice of career, I think he was a man that was actually in touch with what mattered. And his actions showed that, as people have said, no matter who we talked to, he was always genuine, always sincere, and always wanted to do the best by his friends and people he didn't even know. So this attitude totally will bewilder people, by the way. And over the years, I have more than once heard Greg referred to as ageless or timeless or some variation thereof. This, I think, is also why Greg liked to jump around. Some people can settle comfortably into one routine, but Greg could never forget that nothing's permanent, and so lived his life with his eyes fixed on the future. It was a totally charming and refreshing and real attitude, at least to me, and it was something that really I'll never forget. Like a lot of people, I found Greg's presence comforting and inspiring from day one, and so even though I didn't know him for very long, I kept up with him constantly over the last 5 years. I was very lucky in that respect. And the fact that he was 27 years my senior did never seem to cross either of our minds. We were just friends. I must have talked to him at least 3 times the week he passed away, and was completely shaken when I heard the news. We all know people who've gone too early, but I feel like I've really lost someone important with Greg. I know you all feel the same. Now that a little time has passed, though, I recollect one of my favorite little poems by Raymond Carver. I'll repeat it here. And what did you get? And did you get what you wanted from this life? Even so, I did. And what did you want? To call myself beloved, to feel myself beloved on the earth. Greg was totally beloved, and his absence hurts a lot. But we are so lucky, I am so lucky to be able to say that we knew a man who was so beloved on this earth. I hope you're all holding up okay, and thank you for having me here today.
So, as I said, I've received a lot of beautiful condolence messages over these last 7 weeks. And there is this one in particular that stood out for me. Tom Zimmerman, are you in the room? Hi. Because you described Greg as a force of nature. I had never described him in those exact terms, but when I saw that, I thought, yes, that is Greg, the level of energy that he himself could never control. And he channeled a lot of that force of nature energy, not just into his work and to caring for skin people, as he called our human sort, but also into caring for feather people and scale people and fur people. And the very last communication I received from him was actually a text asking how a foster cat of ours was doing. We had been caring for a Foreign Service colleague of mine's cat while she was in Australia, and she was with us for 4 months, and the cat was going to fly to Australia. And he was so worried that she wasn't going to survive the trip. And I had taken her to the vet, and Greg texted me, "How is Miss Rigby?" And I texted back, "She's mad," but I don't think he ever saw that message. Anyway, the force of nature thing about Greg was that he never doubted that if someone needed help, he could provide the needed help. You've heard all of these stories today. Most of the time, he didn't have, in terms of caring for animals, he didn't come to a project with relevant experience or knowledge, but that never stopped him. He always trusted that he could figure out whatever needed to be done and obtain whatever resources needed to be obtained. And Greg and I were together for 24 years, and I could share lots and lots of stories, but I'd like to share just 3 that especially represent why I will always be incredibly proud that I married this guy. The first was July 4th of 2000, and we were living in San Francisco.